In the grand canon of American political historiography, a persistent and reductive irony endures. The nation routinely deifies statesmen who formulated sweeping philosophical doctrines or achieved martial glory, while marginalizing the systemic architects who engineered the structural mechanics of power itself. Martin Van Buren is the preeminent casualty of this romantic myopia. Traditional historical narratives, operating under the patrician biases of the early republic, frequently relegate him to a secondary tier of statecraft. He is depicted as a manipulative, opportunistic operator, the little magician or the red fox of Kinderhook, epithets that subtly demean a profound institutional theorist by reducing his strategic triumphs to mere partisan chicanery. Yet, viewed through the analytical prism of realistic political science and modern statecraft, Van Buren was not an unprincipled trimmer. He was a foundational legislator, a master of administrative execution, and the indispensable institutional designer who resolved the deepest structural crisis of the early American Republic. This crisis was nothing less than the systemic obsolescence of the founding fathers' governance model, which had relied on the unsustainable premise of patrician virtue. As the nation expanded numerically, economically, and geographically, the old deferential politics cracked under the weight of an emergent mass democracy. Van Buren recognized before any of his contemporaries that a continental republic could not be governed by personal networks of elites or classical republican appeals to abstract unity. It required an institutionalized engine, the disciplined, permanent national political party. To understand Van Buren's legacy from a position of political expertise requires parsing his career not as a sentimental biography, but as a rigorous strategic dossier. His core achievement was the institutionalization of political conflict. By converting factionalism from a constitutional existential threat into an engine of democratic stability, Van Buren built the operational bridge between the elite consensus of the revolutionary generation and the mass mobilization of modern democratic states. The structural paralysis of non-party governance, the strategic necessity for Van Buren's institutional innovations becomes starkly apparent when dissecting the systemic rot of the post-war of 1812 political landscape. This period, paradoxically canonized as the era of good feelings under President James Monroe, witnessed the total collapse of the Federalist Party, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the sole political organization in the United States. To the romantic theorists among the founders, this one-party hegemony represented the realization of their ultimate ideal, a unified republic operating without the corrosive effects of organized factionalism. George Washington's farewell warning against the baneful effects of the spirit of party seemed to have been vindicated. In reality, however, the absence of an organized opposition led to complete systemic paralysis. Without the structural discipline imposed by a competing national party, the ruling Democratic-Republican coalition degenerated into an anarchic network of personalized regional fiefdoms. Political conflict did not cease. It merely became unpredictable, erratic, and dangerously sectional. Power was fragmented among ambitious regional chieftains who commanded loyalty based on geography and personal charisma rather than coherent ideology. John Quincy Adams held New England, Henry Clay dominated the West, John C. Calhoun anchored the radical South, and Andrew Jackson commanded the popular imagination of the frontier. The catastrophic election of 1824 exposed the complete bankruptcy of this non-party system. For major candidates, all nominally belonging to the same party, fractured the Electoral College, forcing the decision into the House of Representatives. The subsequent political horse trading that elevated John Quincy Adams to the presidency and Henry Clay to Secretary of State, derided by Jackson's followers as the corrupt bargain, shattered public trust in the constitutional framework. From a system analysis perspective, the 1824 election proved two vital maxims. The patrician model had hit its scale limits. A rapidly expanding continental empire, characterized by explosive population growth, demographic diversification, and the steady elimination of property requirements for voting, could no longer be managed by informal, elite consensus. The absence of a systematic channel for public opinion. As millions of working-class citizens entered the electorate, the constitutional machinery possessed no structural apparatus to absorb, organize, and filter this immense influx of political energy. The result was structural destabilization and an imminent threat of regional polarization. Van Buren, observing this paralysis from his seat in the United States Senate, arrived at a revolutionary conclusion. The primary threat to the American Union was not the presence of political parties, but the absence of them. Without national parties to bind disparate geographic interests together, the nation would inevitably fracture along regional fault lines, north versus south, east versus west. The preservation of the Republic required a radical departure from the founding paradigm. The Albany Regency. The laboratory of professionalized politics. Van Buren's genius lay in his ability to scale a localized organizational model into a national infrastructure. Long before he engineered the National Democratic Party, he perfected the mechanics of machine governance within the state of New York through an organization known as the Albany Regency. Operating in the 1810s and 1820s, the Regency was the world's first modern political machine, and it served as the conceptual laboratory for the professionalization of American politics. The Albany Regency rejected the traditional patrician notion that political power should be wielded only by independent gentlemen of wealth and leisure. Instead, Van Buren and his allies established a meritocratic, highly disciplined hierarchy composed of professional political managers. The Regency operated on three core tenets that revolutionized administrative statecraft. 1. Absolute party discipline and the caucus system. The Regency institutionalized the legislative caucus as the supreme authority of policy and strategy. Before any major vote or nomination, party members met in closed sessions to debate and vote internally. Once a decision was reached by the majority, every single member was required to vote as a unified bloc on the legislative floor, regardless of their personal qualms or constituent pressures. Independent defiance was treated as political treason. This discipline transformed the legislature from a chaotic arena of individual egos into a highly predictable, efficient delivery system for the party's agenda. The functionalization of the spoils system. Van Buren candidly embraced the principle that the distribution of government patronages, clerkships, and public offices should be tied directly to party loyalty, a system later summarized by New York Senator William L. Marcy's phrase, "To the victor belong the spoils." Where elite critics saw systemic corruption, Van Buren saw a fundamental tool of democratic accountability. By ensuring that public officials owed their livelihoods to the collective success of the party, he created a powerful incentive for administrative efficiency and ideological consistency. If the party failed to satisfy the electorate, the entire apparatus would be swept out of office, creating a direct, structural line of accountability between the voters and the bureaucracy. Ideological institutionalization over individual charisma. The Regency was designed to survive the political death or retirement of any single leader, including Van Buren himself. The party represented a collective brand, anchored in specific principles, primarily strict adherence to constitutional limits, states' rights, and a defense of the common laborer against corporate monopolies. By subordinating personal ambition to the institutional identity of the party, Van Buren engineered an organization that was predictable, resilient, and capable of sustained long-term planning. The blueprint for national realignment. The Richie Letter of 1827. Following the debacle of the 1824 election, Van Buren sought to export this New York model to the national stage. His overarching strategic objective was to forge a nationwide political coalition capable of suppressing the dangerous sectionalism that threatened to tear the Union apart over the issue of slavery and federal economic intervention. In January 1827, Van Buren articulated his grand strategy in a historic letter to Thomas Ritchie, the premier political broker of the Virginia Richmond Inquirer. This document stands as a masterwork of geopolitical calculation and party theory. In the letter, Van Buren proposed a formal structural alliance between the planters of the South and the plain Republicans of the North. His rationale was as profound as it was realistic. He argued that the historical conflict between the old Federalist and Jeffersonian Republican parties, despite its intense bitterness, had actually served an essential nationalizing function. Because the ideological divide between those parties ran on philosophical lines, centralized national power versus decentralized agrarian democracy, it cut horizontally across geographic regions. A Jeffersonian in Massachusetts shared a common political vocabulary and shared institutional goals with a Jeffersonian in Virginia. The collapse of those national parties had allowed political alignments to shift from an ideological axis to a purely geographic one, pitting a hostile, protectionist North against a defensive, agrarian South. Van Buren recognized that geographic polarization was a death sentence for the Union. His proposed solution was to artificially revive the old ideological battleground by constructing a new, highly disciplined national organization. This party would champion the strict constructionist, states' rights philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, anchored by the immense popular charisma of General Andrew Jackson. By forcing the American electorate to divide themselves into two competing national parties, Van Buren aimed to compel politicians to seek cross-regional consensus. A Southern planter and a Northern dockworker would be forced to compromise within the same party apparatus to win national elections, thereby neutralizing the radical elements in both regions. The modern Democratic Party was born directly from this structural blueprint, with Andrew Jackson serving as the charismatic figurehead and Martin Van Buren operating as the master architect. The mechanics of mass mobilization to transform this conceptual alliance into a functional reality for the election of 1828. Van Buren constructed a national campaign infrastructure that laid the template for all modern electoral politics. He understood that the expansion of the electorate required an entirely new vocabulary of political engagement. It was no longer enough to publish dry, intellectual essays in elite pamphlets. Politics had to be brought directly to the masses through standard branding, emotional resonance, and institutionalized enthusiasm. Van Buren coordinated an unprecedented network of partisan newspapers across the country, ensuring that synchronized political messaging was distributed simultaneously from Maine to Louisiana. He established national, state, and local committees that monitored voter registration, managed local rallies, and ensured uniform platform delivery. The campaign pioneered the use of popular spectacles, torchlight parades, mass barbecues, hickory pole raisings, and campaign songs, all designed to forge an intense, emotional identity between the ordinary citizen and the Democratic Party. This was not empty showmanship. It was sophisticated behavioral psychology applied to mass governance. Van Buren realized that in a democracy characterized by universal white male suffrage, political loyalty could not be sustained by intellectual assent alone. It had to be anchored in a sense of tribal belonging and collective ownership. The triumph of the Jackson-Van Buren ticket in 1828 vindicated this structural revolution. The election witnessed a doubling of voter turnout, signaling the permanent demise of the old patrician style of campaigning and the dawn of professionalized electoral politics. Cabinet crisis, diplomatic tact, and the succession upon entering the Jackson administration as Secretary of State in 1829, Van Buren faced the immediate challenge of managing a volatile executive branch from within. Jackson's presidency was quickly consumed by intense internal discord, most dramatically exemplified by the Eaton affair. This social and political boycott of Peggy Eaton, the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, was led by the wives of other cabinet members and orchestrated by Vice President John C. Calhoun. While superficial histories treat the Eaton affair as a trivial instance of Washington melodrama, under a realistic political lens, it was a profound constitutional crisis. The boycott paralyzed the executive branch, halted cabinet meetings, and fractured the Democratic coalition along ideological lines, with Calhoun utilizing the scandal to position his radical, state sovereignty faction against Jackson's federal authority. Van Buren, a widower with no domestic entanglement to defend, approached the crisis with consummate diplomatic skill. While Calhoun took a rigid, moralistic stance that infuriated the president, Van Buren offered validation, social courtesy, and political loyalty to Jackson. Recognizing that the internal deadlock was destroying the administration's ability to execute policy, Van Buren devised a brilliant strategic gambit. He voluntarily tendered his resignation as Secretary of State. This calculated act of self-sacrifice provided Jackson with the necessary constitutional pretext to demand the resignation of the entire cabinet. In one clean sweep, Jackson dissolved his dysfunctional administration, purged every ally of John C. Calhoun, and reconstituted a unified executive branch completely loyal to the primary party platform. Van Buren's maneuver was an extraordinary demonstration of tactical flexibility. By stepping down from the premier cabinet position, he eradicated his chief rival, secured Jackson's absolute trust, and guaranteed his own selection as vice president for the 1832 election, positioning himself as the undisputed heir to the presidency. The ideological consolidation. The bank war as a branding strategy. Van Buren's strategic influence during the Jackson presidency extended far beyond personnel management. He was instrumental in defining the programmatic and ideological identity of the Democratic Party, ensuring it became a permanent institutional brand rather than a fleeting cult of personality around Andrew Jackson. This process of ideological consolidation reached its zenith during the Bank War, the protracted political battle over the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. The bank, led by the aristocratic financier Nicholas Biddle, operated as a powerful, semi-private monopoly that controlled the nation's credit, currency, and public revenues. When Henry Clay and the National Republicans pushed for an early recharter of the bank in 1832 to create a wedge issue for the presidential election, Van Buren recognized a historic opportunity. He urged Jackson to veto the bill, understanding that the conflict could serve as the ultimate ideological crucible to unify the party. Van Buren helped craft Jackson's landmark 1832 bank veto message, a document that stands as a masterpiece of populist political communication. The text did not rely merely on dense constitutional technicalities. Instead, it framed the issue as an existential moral struggle between the producing classes of society and a corrupt, entrenched financial elite. The message famously asserted that when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, farmers, mechanics, and laborers, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. By dismantling the bank, the Jackson administration fulfilled a long-standing radical Jeffersonian objective. More importantly, under Van Buren's strategic guidance, they used the conflict to permanently define the Democratic brand. The bank war established an enduring ideological polarity in American politics. The Democrats stood as the institutional champions of hard money, limited government, and agrarian labor independence, while the newly forming Whig Party emerged as the defenders of state-directed economic development, corporate capitalism, and centralized financial institutions. Van Buren had successfully transformed a complex dispute over monetary policy into a sustainable, multi-generational partisan identity. The nullification crisis and the architecture of unionism simultaneously, Van Buren played a critical backstage role in preserving the constitutional integrity of the Union during the nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833. When South Carolina, radicalized by John C. Calhoun's doctrine of state sovereignty, passed an ordinance of nullification declaring federal tariffs null and void within its borders and threatened armed secession, the nation faced its most severe constitutional breakdown since its founding. Van Buren, then serving as minister to Great Britain before returning to assume the vice presidency, advocated a sophisticated dual-track strategy that balanced resolute executive authority with structural, legislative compromise. He enthusiastically supported Jackson's proclamation to the people of South Carolina, which forcefully rejected the right of nullification, branded secession as treason, and asserted the absolute permanence of the federal union. However, Van Buren understood that raw military coercion, even if constitutionally justified, would alienate the wider South and destroy the intersectional political party he had spent a decade building. Operating through his legislative allies in Congress, Van Buren simultaneously engineered the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which provided for a gradual, dramatic reduction of the very duties that had provoked Southern outrage. This classic combination of strategic deterrence and tactical concession defused the crisis without a single drop of bloodshed, demonstrating that a well-organized national party could manage explosive sectional tensions through backroom legislative bargaining rather than military conflict. The imperial presidency and the test of economic depravity. When Martin Van Buren assumed the presidency in 1837, his election represented the absolute validation of his institutional theories. He was the first chief executive who had not participated in the American Revolution, making him the true pioneer of the post-founding generation. Unlike his predecessors, who viewed themselves as nonpartisan statesmen reluctantly answering a civic call, Van Buren proudly identified as a professional party politician. He viewed the presidency not as an altar for individual glory, but as an office tasked with executing a collective party platform derived directly from the popular will. His inaugural address explicitly acknowledged this generational transit, paying elegant tribute to the legendary founders while noting that he belonged to a different era, one that required the systematic management and preservation of an established constitutional republic rather than the heroic, singular act of its creation. However, Van Buren's presidency was almost immediately overwhelmed by the Panic of 1837, the most devastating economic depression the United States had experienced up to that point. Triggered by a complex confluence of international factors, including a sudden tightening of credit by the Bank of England, a collapse in global cotton prices, and the inflationary fallout from the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States. The panic resulted in a systemic collapse of the American financial sector. Hundreds of banks failed, unemployment skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, and public revenues evaporated. The economic catastrophe put Van Buren's political philosophy to its ultimate, agonizing test. The resurgent Whig opposition, championed by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, launched a fierce ideological counteroffensive. They demanded aggressive federal intervention to rescue the economy, advocating for the immediate resurrection of a national bank, the distribution of federal funds to the states, and the implementation of high protective tariffs to insulate domestic manufacturing. For Van Buren, this was a defining moment of systemic risk. If he capitulated to the Whig demands, he could perhaps alleviate short-term economic misery and secure his immediate political survival. However, doing so would permanently compromise the foundational ideology of the Democratic Party, effectively surrendering the federal government back to the Hamiltonian model of state-directed financial capitalism. Van Buren chose systemic consistency over short-term political expediency. The independent treasury, divorcing bank and state. Van Buren's institutional response to the Panic of 1837 was the Independent Treasury Plan, also known as the sub-treasury system. He proposed a total, uncompromising divorce between the federal government and the private banking sector. Under this plan, the United States government would cease depositing its public revenues into private state banks, which routinely used federal funds as a baseline for speculative, inflationary lending. Instead, the government would retain its own revenues in secure, independent vaults managed by federal treasurers in major commercial centers, conducting all public transactions exclusively in gold and silver coin. From a purely macroeconomic perspective, the independent treasury was a highly deflationary policy. By pulling large amounts of specie out of circulation and locking it in government vaults during a severe commercial contraction, the policy restricted credit availability and prolonged the duration of the economic depression. However, viewed through the lens of long-term political strategy and institutional architecture, the independent treasury was a monumental achievement: systemic insulation. It permanently insulated the fiscal operations of the federal government from the volatile booms, busts, and speculative manias of the commercial banking market. Ideological preservation. It gave concrete institutional form to the Jeffersonian-Jacksonian ideal of limited government, ensuring that the federal state could never be utilized as an instrument to enrich a privileged financial class at the expense of ordinary taxpayers. The legislative battle to pass the Independent Treasury Act consumed nearly the entirety of Van Buren's presidency. It required all of his legendary tactical patience, legislative nose-counting, and organizational discipline to hold the fracturing Democratic majority together against the combined resistance of conservative pro-bank Democrats and a furious Whig opposition. The bill was finally signed into law on July 4, 1840, a symbolic date Van Buren deliberately chose to celebrate as America's economic declaration of independence from financial institutions. Though later repealed by the Whigs, the system was permanently reinstated in 1846 and successfully managed federal finances until the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1917, proving the long-term structural viability of Van Buren's institutional design. The geopolitics of restraint, Texas and border diplomatic maneuvers. While domestic policy required ideological rigidity, Van Buren's foreign policy during his presidency revealed a complementary principle of his statecraft: the absolute prioritization of Union stability over territorial aggrandizement. Throughout his career, Van Buren's greatest geopolitical fear was that rapid, unmanaged territorial expansion would inject the explosive issue of slavery directly into national politics, destroying the intersectional equilibrium between North and South that he had worked decades to construct. This cautious philosophy dictated his response to the Republic of Texas. Following its successful rebellion against Mexico in 1836, Texas formally applied for annexation into the United States. Northern abolitionists and anti-slavery Whigs vehemently opposed the measure, recognizing that Sapnap, Texas would add an immense, politically dominant slave territory to the Union, permanently tilting the balance of power toward the South and violating the Missouri Compromise's delicate spirit. Van Buren recognized that annexing Texas would trigger a dual catastrophe: an immediate war with Mexico, which had never recognized Texan independence, and an immediate regional fracture within his own Democratic coalition. He chose to prioritize domestic institutional harmony and international peace over imperial expansion, flatly rejecting the Texan offer of annexation in 1837. This decision infuriated Southern Democrats, who accused the New York president of betraying their regional interests, but it successfully delayed the sectional confrontation over slavery for nearly a decade. Similarly, when border disputes between Maine and New Brunswick led to the undeclared Aroostook War in 1838 to 1839, and Canadian rebels using American soil sparked the volatile Caroline Affair, Van Buren resisted intense popular pressures for a third war with Great Britain. He dispatched General Winfield Scott to negotiate a truce and enforced a policy of rigorous neutrality along the northern border. This strategy of deliberate restraint cost him significant popularity among nationalistic voters, but it preserved the Republic from a ruinous conflict at a time when its domestic economy was already prostrated by depression. The cruel irony of 1840. The system transcends its creator. The presidential election of 1,840 stands as one of the most structurally significant events in American history. It resulted in a devastating defeat for Martin Van Buren, yet it represented the absolute, definitive triumph of the political universe he had spent his life inventing. Recognizing that they could never defeat the organized democratic machine through traditional, elitist appeals, the Whig Party completely abandoned their patrician dignity and adopted Van Buren's methods of mass mobilization, standard branding, and populist showmanship. They bypassed their intellectual leader, Henry Clay, and nominated William Henry Harrison, a venerable military hero of the War of 1812 whose political views were safely ambiguous. The Whigs then launched the legendary Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign, an unprecedented exercise in political myth-making. In a supreme twist of historical irony, they turned Van Buren's own populist rhetoric against him. The Whigs utilized their own synchronized network of partisan newspapers to paint the president as an aloof, effeminate aristocrat who lived in luxury in the White House while ordinary citizens starved. Conversely, they presented Harrison, who was actually a wealthy scion of the Virginia aristocracy living in an elegant mansion, as a simple, rugged frontiersman who drank hard cider and chopped his own wood. The election of 1840 witnessed an unprecedented explosion of Democratic participation, with voter turnout skyrocketing to over 80%. While Van Buren was decisively unseated, the true victor of 1840 was the second-party system itself. The election demonstrated that a highly structured, two-party competition could successfully process a total transfer of executive power during a profound economic crisis without a single drop of blood being spilled or the constitutional framework buckling. Van Buren had built a system so robust that his political opponents were forced to adopt it in its entirety to defeat him, cementing the two-party paradigm as the permanent operational reality of American democracy. The Lon Ran Do of the Statesman. The Free Soil Realignment, 1844 to 1848. Van Buren's retirement from the presidency did not mark the end of his strategic impact. Instead, his later career revealed the tragic limitations of his intersectional party model and his ultimate willingness to prioritize founding constitutional principles over party discipline when the survival of the Union was at stake. By 1844, Van Buren remained the titular head of the Democratic Party and the clear frontrunner for the presidential nomination. However, the issue of Texas annexation returned to center stage. Knowing that opposition to annexation would cost him the vital support of the Southern planter wing of his party, Van Buren nevertheless published his famous Hampton's Letter in April 1844. In it, he reiterated his principled opposition to immediate annexation, warning that it would plunge the nation into an unjust war and inflame sectional passions over slavery. The political retribution was swift and clinical. At the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore, Southern delegates utilized the party's two-thirds majority rule, a mechanism originally designed to ensure broad consensus, to block Van Buren's nomination, ultimately selecting James K. Polk, an avowed expansionist. Van Buren was discarded by the very machine he had engineered. This rejection marked a critical ideological evolution for Van Buren. He began to realize that the Southern planter class, which he had once viewed as a conservative partner in a balanced national coalition, had become radicalized. They were no longer interested in preserving a cross-regional consensus party, They demanded that the entire National Party apparatus be subservient to the defense and territorial expansion of human bondage. The culmination of this shift occurred in 1848. Observing the Mexican-American War and the subsequent attempt by Southern radicals to open all newly acquired Western territories to slavery, Van Buren took a step that shocked the political establishment. He accepted the presidential nomination of the newly formed Free Soil Party. Running on a platform of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men, Van Buren's 1848 candidacy appeared to be a total self-contradiction for a man who had spent his life preaching the gospel of strict party regularity and regional compromise. But viewed deeply, it was remarkably consistent with his core identity as a protector of the Union. When the Democratic Party ceased to be an instrument of national stabilization and instead became an engine for the expansion of slaveholder power, Van Buren recognized that the party brand had become toxic to the Republic. His Free Soil candidacy, while capturing 0 electoral votes, elevated the anti-slavery movement into a mainstream national political force and laid the direct organizational foundation for the Republican Party. He proved that when the survival of the constitutional system collided with the survival of the party machine, he would unhesitatingly break the machine to protect the foundation. Conclusion. The realist of the American experiment to properly evaluate Martin Van Buren's historical legacy is to recognize him as the indispensable realist of the American experiment. For generations, he has been overshadowed by the intellectual elegance of Jefferson, the administrative majesty of Hamilton, and the primitive force of Jackson. Yet, all of their abstract theories and personal charisma would have amounted to little more than a fleeting historical curiosity without the resilient, institutional architecture that Van Buren designed to sustain them. The direct, personalized governance of the Founding Fathers was engineered for an elite, homogeneous society of property-owning gentlemen. It was structurally incapable of managing a continental nation characterized by rapid population growth, industrialization, and mass immigration. Without the development of professional political parties to aggregate interests and institutionalize conflict, the United States would have likely devolved into an anarchic cycle of regional wars, military dictatorships, or fragmented oligarchies. Van Buren understood before anyone else that in a true democracy, institutional machinery must replace personal aristocracy. He transformed the political party from an object of revolutionary dread into an essential instrument of democratic empowerment. By establishing organized national parties that competed on ideas, policy platforms, and administrative competence, he created a permanent structural safety valve for the Republic. Ultimately, Martin Van Buren bridged the gap between two founding eras by preserving the philosophical principles of the First Republic within the robust, practical machinery of the Second. He took the abstract constitutional concepts of popular sovereignty and states' rights and translated them into a functional, everyday political culture that ordinary citizens could own and operate. He was the mastermind who realized that for a democracy to endure, it could not rely on the sporadic appearance of virtuous heroes or brilliant philosophers. It required a resilient, predictable framework that empowered ordinary humans to govern themselves through the messy, collective, permanent work of party politics. In doing so, the little magician performed the greatest political miracle in American history. He ensured that the government of the people survived its critical transition into the modern world.